Okay, so today we're diving into some, well, pretty heavy stuff with this article called The Threat of Islam.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic that gets people fired up, especially when we're talking about, Western civilization and all that.
Right. And this article isn't just talking about Islam as a religion, like what people believe.
It's like they're saying Islam is a whole package deal.
Yeah, they call it a totalizing system, which sounds kind of intense.
It's like their whole deal, like it's not just praying 5 times a day.
It's about how you run your government, your laws, everything.
Exactly.
That-
And that's where they start talking about power, which gets really interesting.
Okay, so how does this article see power differently?
Well, they make this point about how in Islamic societies, historically speaking,
Historically, yeah.
you often have this one big cheese, right?
Like a king or emperor or something.
Kind of, but in this case, it's the caliph. And he's not just a political leader.
He's got religious authority, too.
Bingo. Like a pope and a king, all rolled into one. So imagine the kind of power that brings...
Yeah, that's a lot of influence concentrated in one place.
Exactly. And because of that, they argue that the line between religious institutions and the state can get kind of blurry.
Which is pretty different from how we usually do things in the West.
Night and day, right. I mean, we're always talking about separation of church and state over here.
Right, like those two should stay in their own lanes.
And this article calls that compartmentalized power, where you've got these different spheres of influence.
Okay, I see where they're going with this.
Like in Christian societies, they say the church has its thing, the state has its thing, and they might work together sometimes.
But they shouldn't be calling the shots for each other.
Exactly. It's like that whole checks and balances thing they talk about in government.
But for religion and politics instead. And that got me thinking about, like, how these different ideas of power have shaped history.
Right. Like, just imagine how differently things might have gone if Western societies hadn't made that separation.
Wild, right?
Totally. And it all comes back to how they define power in this article. It's not just about brute force,
It's more nuanced than that.
way more. They're saying true power is about control, about restraint.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example.
They actually use God, which I thought was pretty bold.
Okay.
But their point is, God is all-powerful, right? So he doesn't need to go around flexing all the time.
He doesn't need to prove anything.
Exactly. His restraint, his willingness to not use his full power all the time, that's what makes him truly powerful.
Interesting. See what they're getting at.
And they contrast this with what they see as, well, a less restrained approach to power, let's say, in other contexts.
And I'm guessing they bring up Islam here.
They do. They point to some examples from Muhammad's life, how some people interpret his actions,
And they're drawing a contrast between these different approaches to power.
Exactly. Like one emphasizes this measured strength,
Yeah.
while the other might be interpreted as glorifying unchecked force, or at least that's how this article seems to be framing it.
Which is a pretty bold claim to make.
For sure. And we definitely need to be careful not to oversimplify things here.
Right. It's not like every culture or religion neatly fits into one box or the other.
Exactly. But this contrast that they're setting up is super important because it lays the foundation for their whole argument about why they see Islamic and Western civilization as being on such different wavelengths.
Yeah.
And how that could lead to some serious problems down the road.
Okay, so we've got these different ways of looking at power, but then this article takes a sharp turn into, like, how these differences are playing out in the real world.
Yeah. And they don't shy away from controversy at all.
Not even a little bit, especially when they get to the whole issue of, well, Islamic immigration.
Right, like how people are moving from predominantly Islamic countries to Western nations.
And this is where they really start sounding the alarm bells.
Big time. They basically come right out and say that this wave of Islamic immigration is a direct threat to Western civilization as we know it.
Wow. Okay, so they're not holding back, are they? But, like, how do they even begin to justify that kind of statement?
Well, they start by talking about mass immigration in general, not just from Islamic countries.
Okay, so like how globalization has led to more people moving around the world than ever before.
Exactly. And their argument is that a lot of the justifications we hear for mass immigration, like it's good for the economy or it makes our cultures more diverse,
Right, those kinds of arguments.
they say those arguments might be masking something else entirely.
Like a hidden agenda.
Exactly. They even go so far as to claim there's this, like, hostile ruling elite that's deliberately using mass immigration to undermine Western societies from within.
Okay, now that sounds like something out of a conspiracy theory.
It definitely has that vibe, right?
Hmm.
But whether you buy into that whole hostile elite thing or not, their point is that there are powerful forces that benefit from mass immigration, even if it comes at the expense of the average person.
And I'm guessing they're particularly worried about Islamic immigration because they see it as like a more fundamental clash of values than we see with other groups.
That's the gist of it. They bring him Sharia law again, how it's so different from Western legal traditions.
And they're worried about what happens when those two systems collide.
Exactly. They argue it could lead to all sorts of conflicts and tensions, especially as demographics shift, and more people from Islamic backgrounds become citizens of Western nations.
So they're not talking about some kind of violent takeover or anything.
No, it's more like they're envisioning this gradual erosion of Western values and traditions over time.
Like a slow burn cultural transformation that I might not fully realize is happening until it's too late.
Exactly. It's like they're saying, hey, even if Islamic immigration isn't an immediate threat, it's a long game, and the West needs to wake up to the potential consequences.
And I'm sensing those consequences they're talking about probably tie back into that whole need for strength they were emphasizing earlier.
Oh, absolutely. That's where they bring it all together.
So we're talking about long-term, like really long-term consequences here, but then what do they think we should be doing about it now?
Well, they keep coming back to this idea of strength, right? Like, that's the key to everything.
Which, I mean, it makes sense in a way. Like, if you're feeling threatened, you want to feel strong enough to face that threat, right?
Sure. And they're basically saying that the West has gotten a little soft, a little too focused on being nice and trying to get along with everyone.
And that's a problem.
Well, they seem to think so, yeah. They argue that it's like we've forgotten how to be tough, how to stand up for ourselves when it really counts.
So it's not just about being nice anymore. It's about, like, showing the world that we mean business.
Yeah, that we're not afraid to throw our weight around if we have to.
Which is a pretty big shift from, like, the whole diplomacy first approach that we usually hear about.
Huge shift. They're talking about being more assertive, more willing to use our power, even if it makes some people uncomfortable.
Okay, but what does that actually look like in practice? I mean, are they suggesting we go around picking fights?
Not necessarily, no. It's more like they're saying we need to project an aura of strength, you know?
Okay, so less about starting conflicts, more about deterring them. Like making it clear that there's a line you don't cross.
Exactly. And that could mean different things depending on the situation.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, they talk about stronger military, obviously.
Makes sense, right? Like having a strong military can make other countries think twice about messing with you.
Right, it's a deterrent. But they also talk about being less afraid to use economic leverage, you know?
Oh, so like sanctions and stuff.
Exactly. Or even just being willing to walk away from trade deals that aren't beneficial to us.
So it's about being more strategic with our relationships,
Mhm.
not just assuming that everyone has the same goals.
Exactly. And being willing to walk away from relationships that aren't working, even if it means ruffling some feathers.
Okay. That's a pretty different way of looking at things.
It is, and it's definitely something to think about. I mean, this whole idea of projecting strength, it's not without its risks, right?
Yeah, like where do you draw the line? When does strength become aggression?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's not one with an easy answer.
Definitely not. I think we've covered a lot of ground here, from this idea of a clash of civilizations to the nature of power itself, and now this call for the West to, like, rediscover its inner strength.
It's a lot to digest, that's for sure.
It really, but I think it's important to have these kinds of conversations, even if they're uncomfortable sometimes.
Absolutely. I mean, the world is changing fast, and we need to be ready to adapt.
And maybe part of that adaptation is rethinking some of our assumptions about power, about strength, about what it means to be a global power in the 21st century.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, we'll leave you all to ponder these big questions.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Until next time.